I was drying a chipped mug when the doorbell cut through the quiet like a blade. The sky over Seattle hung low and gray, and rain tapped impatiently against the windows of my penthouse. The home I bought after rebuilding a life I never thought I'd lose. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if the sound was another trick of memory. After 12 years of living alone, silence becomes a roommate that doesn't like to leave. My name is Margaret Sullivan. For more than a decade, my son and his wife behaved as if I no longer existed. The bell rang again, sharp, urgent. I wiped my damp fingers on a dish towel and walked slowly toward the door. My steps echoed against the hardwood floors, each one stirring a mixture of dread and anger I thought I had buried long ago. This apartment had become sacred to me, a place where no one could reach in and twist the truth of who I was. Certainly not the people who once cut me out of their lives with the precision of a scalpel. When I reached the door, I pressed my eye to the peephole out of habit. And there they were. David, my only child, stood hunched, his shoulders drooping beneath the weight of something heavier than the rain soaking his jacket. Beside him, gripping the handle of a worn suitcase, was Rachel. The same Rachel who once used her position at a small law office to send me a letter crafted in calm clinical legal ease, warning me to cease all contact with my newborn granddaughter or face necessary protective action. My breath left me so suddenly I had to steady myself with a hand against the wall. The hallway lights cast a pale glow on their faces. David looked older, exhausted in a way grief alone couldn't explain. Rachel's eyes were red, but not with remorse. Hers were the tears of someone cornered by circumstance, not conscience. I unlocked the deadbolt, but left the chain in place. When I cracked the door open, the smell of cold air and wet wool drifted in. David managed a strained smile, though his lips trembled. "Mom," he said softly, a word I hadn't heard from him in 12 years. We don't have anywhere else to go." The old wound inside me throbbed. I looked at the man who once promised he'd never leave me, at the woman who spent years convincing him I was a threat. And I felt a storm of emotions, grief, fury, disbelief, and a strange, unwelcome tenderness. They might need me now, but I had learned painfully and thoroughly how to live without them. And what neither of them knew was that their arrival would force open every locked room of our past. I remember the last time David stood in front of me with that same hollow look, the kind that made him seem both like a grown man and a frightened boy. It wasn't on my doorstep the way it happened today, but in a cramped exam room under fluorescent lights 18 years ago. The oncologist had just finished explaining that Richard, my husband of 3 decades, the man who drove trucks up and down the West Coast and brought home stories from every tiny diner along the way, had late-stage lung cancer. The air in the room felt thick, as if the walls were closing in on us. I felt my knees weaken, and for a moment, I thought I might vomit or faint or simply dissolve under the weight of the word terminal. David was 21 then, still in the navy blue uniform from his shift at the logistics company. He sat rigid in a plastic chair, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles widened. When the doctor stepped out to give us a moment alone, the silence swelled. Richard reached for my hand with fingers that already trembled, and I leaned into him, holding on to the warmth of his skin. David stared at the floor, blinking quickly as though he could force back the grief, by will alone. The months that followed settled into a rhythm I wish I could forget. Our tidy little home in the suburbs became a maze of pill bottles arranged by dosage times, stacks of medical forms, and blankets folded on the couch for the nights Richard no longer had the strength to climb the stairs. I took a leave from the elementary school where I taught second graders, believing it would be temporary. I didn't know then how long the road ahead would stretch. David visited every evening after work. He smelled of cold air and engine grease. And sometimes he carried grocery bags filled with things Richard could no longer eat, but that he brought anyway. Desperate to help, he talked about work, about jokes from coworkers, about the Seahawks' chances that season, anything that might make his father smile. Richard would nod or chuckle faintly, but mostly he listened. When David left each night, he would hug me too tightly and whisper that we were going to be all right. I never contradicted him, even when fear twisted like barbed wire in my chest. The winter Richard died was bitter and gray. Snow dusted the windowsills. The morning his breathing changed, turning shallow and soft, like someone quietly slipping away. I sat beside him, holding his hand, whispering that he wasn't alone. When he exhaled for the last time, the world seemed to tilt. I pressed my forehead against his and stayed like that until the hospice nurse gently touched my shoulder. Grief didn't burst in. It seeped into every part of me like a cold draft that couldn't be shut out. At the funeral, David stood between me and the casket, straight back, jaw tight, as though bracing against a storm. He held my hand with a fierceness that startled me. After the service, he said he wasn't going anywhere. Not now, not when it was just the two of us left. I clung to those words with the desperation of someone who had lost too much too quickly. For a time, he meant them. David moved back into his childhood bedroom, bringing with him the smell of diesel from work and the sound of heavy boots on the hallway floor. We created a quiet routine, simple dinners at the oak table Richard refinished years before, evenings watching old movies, mornings where David grabbed coffee on his way out the door while I packed leftovers for his lunch. The house felt unfamiliar without Richard's laughter or his boots by the door, but with David there, it didn't feel empty. Looking back, I see how tightly I held on to him. He was my anchor in a world that had suddenly come unmoored. I told myself that he needed me just as much, that we were helping each other through the worst season of our lives. Maybe that was true at first, but grief has a strange way of binding people together while sowing the seeds that will eventually push them apart. I didn't recognize the difference. I didn't notice how small the space between us had become. Small enough that neither of us had room to grow without bumping into the other. And then, when the first hint of spring finally touched the neighborhood, David met someone new. I didn't know it then, but the moment she stepped into his life, the balance between us shifted forever. It was subtle in the beginning, the kind of shift you only feel in hindsight, but it was there, steady and certain, like a current pulling him away from shore. David introduced me to Rachel on a mild spring afternoon, the kind Seattle generously offers between long stretches of rain. He chose a little diner by the waterfront, the kind with checkered floors and windows that fog over when the wind blows in from the sound. I arrived early, nerves prickling beneath my sweater, wondering if meeting this woman would feel like crossing some invisible threshold. When David walked through the door with her beside him, I felt the shift instantly. She was beautiful in a precise way, straight dark hair, tailored coat, careful posture. But what struck me most were her eyes, sharp and assessing as if she were bracing for judgment before any had been passed. David hugged me quickly, then pulled out her chair. Rachel extended her hand, her polite smile not quite reaching her eyes. I felt something guarded in her, something brittle. But I brushed the thought aside. After losing Richard, I had promised myself I would embrace whatever new chapter life offered my son. So, I greeted her warmly and tried to hide my trembling excitement at the idea of David finding someone who might love him the way he deserved. The conversation started easily enough. I asked about her work, and she told me she was a paralegal at a small firm downtown. She spoke with crisp confidence, the kind of person who measures words before speaking them when I mentioned my years of teaching second grade. She nodded politely, though her gaze drifted toward the window, as if the mention of children made her uneasy. I chalked it up to first meeting nerves. I tried to fill the silences, telling small stories about David's childhood, his obsession with dinosaurs, his fear of thunderstorms. But each time Rachel's shoulders stiffened, and I could tell she didn't like conversations that placed her outside the circle. When the server brought our meals, I offered Rachel a small box of cookies I had baked that morning. It was something I'd done for decades, baking as a gesture of welcome. She accepted the box with a tight smile, murmuring a thank you, but her fingers curled around it as if she wasn't sure whether it was a gift or a test. On the drive home, she later told David the cookies were wonderful, but the gesture itself felt a little intense. I didn't know any of this then, of course. What I felt at the time was just a faint shift in the air, like the first sign of weather turning. David fell for her quickly. Within months, he was talking about moving in together, building something new. I wanted to be happy for him, but watching him pack up his childhood room, Sealing away pieces of our shared life into cardboard boxes made my chest ache. He promised it wouldn't change anything between us. I nodded and pretended to believe him, though part of me sensed that something fundamental had already begun to slip. The first real tension came the night David invited me over to their new apartment. I had spent the day cooking a pot of stew, Richard's favorite recipe, and I arrived with a steaming container wrapped in a towel to keep it warm. Rachel opened the door, and in her eyes I saw a flicker of something I couldn't quite decipher. Annoyance, maybe, or fear. The apartment was spotless, decorated with minimalist touches, and my pot of stew looked out of place in her pristine kitchen. She thanked me, but her voice had cooled. During dinner, each time I offered to help clear plates or pack leftovers, she insisted she could manage. When the conversation turned to childhood memories again, she inserted a new phrase into nearly every response. "We just need our space." At first, I didn't realize what she meant. Later that night, David explained that Rachel believed healthy boundaries were essential. She felt I was too eager, too involved, that my gestures, dinner, gifts, visits could unintentionally cross lines. I went to bed that night staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how kindness could be misread as intrusion. I wondered if I had clung too tightly to David after losing Richard. Maybe Rachel saw a version of me I hadn't meant to project, a mother afraid to let go. But boundaries soon turned into barriers. Weekends that we used to spend together became private time. Phone calls went unanswered. Texts replied to hours later with brief, clipped messages. I told myself not to take it personally, that young couples deserve space to build their own rhythm. Yet, the silence grew louder each week, thick enough that I sometimes paced my living room just to hear the sound of my own footsteps. The breaking point came one Sunday when I stopped by with a basket of fresh bread. I had texted David earlier, but hadn't received a reply. When Rachel opened the door, she stepped into the hallway and closed it behind her, preventing me from seeing inside. She thanked me for the bread, but her tone was firm, almost rehearsed. She said she preferred advance notice before visits, that unannounced drop-ins made her uncomfortable, and that she needed me to respect their home as their space. Her words stung, sharp enough to draw invisible blood. I apologized, though I wasn't sure what I had truly done wrong. As I walked back to my car, holding the empty basket against my chest, I felt something familiar tighten around my ribs, the same hollow ache I'd felt after Richard died, when the world quietly shifted and left me scrambling to understand my new place in it. I didn't know then that losing a husband was only the first loss I would have to survive. The next one was already on its way. And unlike death, it wouldn't take a single moment. It would take years. Lily was born on a gray November morning 2 years after that hallway conversation. And for a brief moment, I believed the arrival of a baby might soften whatever invisible wall had grown between me and my son's new family. When David called to say Rachel had gone into labor, I grabbed my coat, packed a small bag of knitted blankets I'd made, and rushed to the hospital through sheets of cold rain. I remember sitting in the waiting room, heart thudding with anticipation, imagining the moment I would hold my granddaughter for the first time. When David finally appeared, his face lit with exhaustion and pride, I felt something inside me unravel. He guided me to the room where Rachel lay propped against pillows, pale and tired, but glowing in the way new mothers often do. Lily was tiny, wrapped in a pink blanket, her fist curled like a seashell. I asked if I could hold her, and Rachel hesitated for a second, just long enough to sting before handing her over. The warmth of that little body against my chest was unlike anything I'd felt since David himself was born. For a moment, I let myself believe we were beginning a new chapter, one where love might repair what tension had frayed. But the shift came quickly, subtle at first. The next day, when I returned with soup and fresh clothes, Rachel mentioned new rules the pediatrician had apparently emphasized. No kissing the baby's face, limited visitors, hand-washing procedures strict enough to resemble a medical protocol. I nodded, wanting to be respectful, but every attempt I made to be helpful seemed to trigger something in her. If I adjusted a blanket, she fixed it again. If I offered an opinion, she countered it with a firm reference to expert advice. David barely noticed the strain. He floated through those first days on a cloud of fatherly pride. When they finally took Lily home, I baked a tray of lasagna and brought over groceries so they wouldn't have to cook. Rachel took the bags but didn't invite me inside. She said Lily was fussy, that they needed rest, that maybe I could come another time. Her smile never reached her eyes. A week later, I asked if I could stop by to help with laundry or hold the baby while she showered. Rachel replied with a text an hour later, saying she preferred to keep visitors limited during recovery. I told myself this was normal for new parents, that I was overthinking it. But I knew something was wrong the night I arrived with a box of diapers I'd bought on sale. I knocked, waited, and knocked again. When Rachel opened the door, she stepped out into the hallway and closed it behind her, just as she had with the bread. She thanked me, but said they needed predictability in their routine, and asked that I call before coming over, even if it was just to drop something off. Her voice was polite, but her eyes were sharp, as if she were managing a threat rather than speaking to her husband's mother. I drove home gripping the steering wheel, so tightly my wrists ached. I kept repeating that she was tired, that new motherhood could make anyone protective, that I had to give her time. And so I pulled back, waiting for an invitation that never came. Weeks turned into months. I saw Lily only during brief, supervised visits when David arranged to meet me in public places, a cafe, a park bench, the corner table in a bookstore. Rachel rarely joined. When she did, she watched every movement I made around the baby with a scrutiny that made my skin prickle. If I held Lily too long, she gently reminded me the baby needed to nap. If I mentioned how David had loved mashed bananas as a child, she said with a stiff smile that current feeding guidelines were different now. I kept bending, hoping patience would mend whatever rift I couldn't see. But the bending slowly turned into shrinking. I stopped offering help unless asked. I stopped suggesting visits. Sometimes I waited days before texting, afraid even a simple good morning would be interpreted as overstepping. Then came Lily's second birthday. I arrived at their apartment with a gift I'd spent weeks choosing, a small easel and watercolor set, thinking she might enjoy painting the way David had when he was little. The moment I stepped inside, I felt Rachel watching me. The party was small, mostly parents from their building and a couple of David's coworkers. I set the gift on the table with the others and drifted toward the kitchen to ask if I could help. Rachel shook her head with that tight smile I had come to dread. The moment that changed everything happened while I was slicing fruit at the counter. A glass fell, shattering loudly on the tile. And before I could register what happened, Rachel swooped in with wide, frantic eyes, declaring that I'd placed it too close to the edge, that Lily could have been hurt, that this was exactly why boundaries were necessary. David rushed over, confused, but automatically siding with her. I tried to explain that I hadn't touched the glass, that I didn't even know it was near me. But Rachel was already sweeping shards into a dustpan, shaking her head, muttering that she had warned him. I left the party early, heart pounding, face burning with shame I didn't understand. As I walked down the hallway toward the elevator, I had the suffocating feeling that something irreversible had just happened. I didn't know then how right I was. The real blow was still coming, wrapped in legal language, so cold it might as well have been carved from ice, and it would arrive in my mailbox just days later. The letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon, tucked between a grocery flyer and a utility bill. I didn't recognize the return address, but the firm's name was printed in sharp black type across the top, a name I later learned belonged to the law office where Rachel worked. Inside was a 2-page notice written in calm clinical language. It stated that my behavior had caused distress, that continued attempts at contact could be interpreted as harassment, and that all communication with David and Lily should cease until further notice. I remember standing in my kitchen, the refrigerator humming behind me, reading those sentences again and again until the words blurred. I thought it had to be a mistake. Surely David hadn't agreed to this. Surely Rachel hadn't twisted things so far that I had become the villain in my own family. When I called David, he didn't answer. When I texted, the message delivered, but never turned blue. I waited hours, then days, pacing the living room like a ghost trapped between rooms. Eventually, he wrote back. A short message that felt rehearsed. He said they needed space. He said it was better for everyone. He said he hoped I understood. I didn't. But I understood the silence that followed. It was absolute. The weeks after that dissolved into a blur of sleepless nights and meals I forgot to eat. I would sit at the edge of my bed, staring at the framed picture of David as a little boy with chocolate frosting on his cheeks, wondering how the same child who once clung to my leg could now believe I was dangerous. There were nights when the weight of that thought pressed so heavily on my chest that I struggled to breathe. I felt myself slipping into a place even darker than the one I had fallen into after Richard died. A place where the world felt smaller each day, shrinking around a single relentless question. What did I do that was so unforgivable? One evening, after crying until my eyes stung, I found myself holding a bottle of sleeping pills. I sat on the floor with my back against the cabinet, the cold tile seeping through my clothes. The thought came quietly, almost gently. One choice could end this pain. But then my gaze drifted upward, landing on the small stack of children's drawings pinned to the fridge. Souvenirs from my years of teaching. Bright colors, crooked hearts, stick figure families, love captured in crayons. Something inside me softened. I set the bottle aside and pressed my forehead to my knees until the storm inside me passed. The next morning, I opened my baking cabinet. Flour dusted the air as I reached for a mixing bowl. I didn't know what I was making. Cookies, bread, anything. But the familiar motion steadied my hands. Baking had always been my quiet language of love, the one thing no one could take from me. As the oven warmed and the scent of vanilla filled the kitchen, I realized I was still here, bruised. Yes, alone certainly, but alive. And for the first time in months, that felt like enough to begin again.